big good morning to everyone who has joined us today. My name is Andrea Davis. I am the International Programme Manager at the Service College, and I am joined today by Dr. Corrado Macchiarelli. Good morning. And Corrado is from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and we are working in collaboration to deliver today's session on Why Forecast, a Policymaker's Guide During Uncertain Times. The session will last probably up to 1 hour. Please feel free to use the chat box as mentioned to ask any questions. We want to try and make it as engaging as possible, or feel free to leave your questions until the very end. We are going to be sending you the recording probably towards the end of today or early next week. So please do look out for that, and you can share that with any of your contacts, clients, colleagues, and so on. So if we could just go to the next slide, please, Corrado, that would be great. Thank you very much. So for those that have joined us today, if you haven't actually attended one of our webinars before, this is our UK footprint. So here is the Civil Service College, and where are we? We are an independent training organisation that offers training solutions to the UK civil service and the wider public sector. We have delivered training to not just central government departments, such as the Cabinet Office, DEFRA and DWP, but also devolved administrations like the Welsh Government and, of course, our NHS, as well as local authorities. If you could just go to the next slide, please, Corrado. Not only do we work in the UK, but of course we work around the world as well. So you can see our international footprint here. If we do have anyone from, various different countries, a big hello to you. We do actually offer training both in country and the UK. So we can actually design something for you where you can come over to do your training in one of our classrooms when travel permits, of course. And we also do have a pool of trainers that can deliver your training to you in your organisation, in your country. So if you do want to speak to me about any international training, please feel free, and I'll provide my email address at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please, Corrado. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so as mentioned, we are joined by Dr. Corrado Macchiarelli this morning. Dr. Corrado Macchiarelli is a principal economist in the macroeconomic modelling and forecasting team of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. He is also an associate professor in finance and economics at Brunel University, London, a part-time lecturer at New York University's Stern School of Business, and a visiting fellow in European political economy at London School of Economics. Previously, Dr. Macchiarelli was an economist at the European Central Bank and working chiefly in the working group of forecast on potential output. So if we can get started, Corrado, that would be absolutely fantastic. A big good morning to you, and I'll leave it to you now. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone, and thanks very much, Andrea. It's my pleasure to, join the civil service this morning with this sort of introductory and overview about uncertainty and forecasting. So I've structured the presentation in a way that could be appealing to people who work in policymaking or close to policymaking. I'm sure many of the issues we will discuss this morning will be familiar with many of you. And as Andrea said, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat box, or even sort of read them out or speak in case I miss any questions. I'm very happy to take questions as we go along. So the way I've structured the presentation today is along 5 points. I'll try to explain why we need economic forecasting at all, and what does a reliable forecast look like. As you might probably know, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, which is my employer, is one of the oldest forecasting institutions in the UK. We do provide quarterly forecasts for both the UK and the world economy, and we work on many issues which are both current and developing global issues. For instance, at the moment, we're working heavily on the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy, as well as the UK economy, with different, of course, repercussions depending on the assumptions that we make, and which I'm happy also to cover towards the end of the presentation. I will conclude with a checklist of what is a good economic forecast, and hopefully we will be able to agree on these. So what is forecasting really? So forecast is, if we take the dictionary definition of forecasting, then obviously forecasting is about trying to predict what is going to happen in the future. But very importantly, this is conditional on the information that we have up to date. So bear that information in mind, because of course, when we think about predicting or forecasting, we have to consider that, as forecasters, we do have an information set, so to say, and that information set ends at the time in which we are currently. Okay, so obviously we do not know what's going to happen in the future. So conditioning that information set to the information available up to date is indeed what forecasting is about. And why do we produce forecasts? Is essentially to use those as a guide for take decisions. The key question is whether forecasts in macroeconomic policy, which is the environment in which we operate and I operate, whether these forecasts help us take better decisions or policy or outcome. So think about forecasting as a way to navigate uncertain times and an uncertain future. Obviously, that is the whole point of forecasting, if you think about it, right? So the only reason why we want to forecast and we want to understand how the economy is going to behave, say, within the next day, the next year, 5 years, 10 years, or month, is because we want to take better decisions and policy decisions. So there is a very subtle yet important difference between conditional and unconditional forecasting. So to help you understand that, think about predicting the outcome of the exercise of rolling two dice. So it's very difficult to predict the outcome if you roll two dice at the same time, and that would be an unconditional forecast. But if you have the outcome of one dice already, say that single dice tells you that the outcome is 6, then you might be able to narrow the outcome of rolling the two dice to a shorter set of options, because you already know that you have a 6 on the table. And that is what is called a conditional forecast. So conditional forecast, which means I know something already, obviously is in a way easier, because you restrict the range of possible outcomes when I make a prediction. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So coming back to the starting point and the title of the presentation. So why do we want to focus in economic terms? Well, if we look at the economy as the aggregation of individual making economic decisions, obviously knowing what's going to happen in the future would help us smooth our consumption over the life cycle, which means we might decide today how much money we want to save, how much money we want to invest, and so on and so forth. Okay, so if you think about your daily decision, this is all about planning for the future. And by saving or investing, you're automatically shifting some of your consumption to the future. That's the whole point of saving, right? So you transfer some of your income today to the future, because you don't want to consume all of your income today. And so that exercise of saving, dis-saving, investing, and so on and so forth is all an exercise that we implicitly do in terms of forecasting. But also, gambling and insurance. So taking insurance implies that you're making a risk assessment of your life or your behavior. as well as planning. Also, saving and sort of investing in wealth, say buying a house, implies that you're making an exercise of you being solvent in the future, particularly against the backdrop of not knowing how taxes will change. But also, it's not useful for us as individual consumers in the economy. It's obviously useful for all the agents operating in the economy, namely firms, but also obviously government and the central bank, who are normally in charge of macroeconomic policy stabilization. So we'll get back to that, but essentially, forecasting the future helps the government, plan fiscal policy, at least for the year ahead, meaning how to use public expenditure and taxation, but also helps monetary policy, in this case the Bank of England, to think about how to use interest rates and have an impact on the economy. So obviously the whole point of forecasting, if we look at these in the aggregate, meaning from the point of view of the economy as a whole, so from a macroeconomic point of view, is that of macroeconomic policy stabilization. So I believe many of you would probably have seen a series or a plot of GDP growth over a number of years. And if you look at GDP growth, as well as other series such as unemployment or inflation and so on, you probably would see that those series would tend to display what we call a cyclical behavior. So they would tend to fluctuate either around zero if they are, say, GDP growth, or around a trend. And so these fluctuations up and downs denote what we call in macroeconomic terms a business cycle, which is the alternation of peak and trough, where a peak, if we're talking about GDP, denotes an expansion, and a trough denotes a recession. So the idea of macroeconomic policy stabilization is that indeed fiscal policy and monetary policy can help smooth those cycles. So if there is a recession, if there is a shock, so say hitting the economy, think about COVID-19, then monetary policy and fiscal policy will activate in order to smooth the negative impact of the shock on the macroeconomy. And the best way for the Bank of England and fiscal policy, HMT, to think about how to smooth, what are the best policies to smooth the adverse effect of the pandemic, is to have a prediction or have a, so to say, educated guess about how the pandemic will play out. Okay, that's the whole idea. Obviously, there is a lot of uncertainty about the global economy nowadays. There are some long-standing issues, some of which are, say, more country-specific. So what are the long-run consequences of Brexit? An issue that has been, overstudied, if you want, but also secular stagnation. We've witnessed, the compression of, for those of you who follow financial markets, say risk premia, compression of bond interest rates, as well as low real rates across the board. And this is reflecting very long-term sort of trends that yet provide some uncertainty because we really don't know how long this is going to be for. Of course, we know some of the main drivers of these factors, some of which are more obvious, as in the case of Brexit. So there is a sort of event, but some others, such as secular stagnation, as I said, have a sort of long-term origin, and those are trends that have been going on perhaps since the 90s and so on. I mean, particularly for the bond market. But also we have more recently things happening as we speak. The US-China trade war, which was very topical during 2009. 2019, so the Trump administration, there is not much talking about whether inflation will pick up, which would, of course, very important implications for planning and policy, but also private consumption. Will the COVID vaccine be effective? How quick the rollout is going to be? Is that going to be enough to, go back to normal, quotation marks? So a lot of question marks. And I'll show you, and I'll try to explain how we can use macroeconomic modeling and macroeconomic models to try and answer some of those questions, and in a way narrow the uncertainty to something smaller. So what do we need to have reliable forecasts? So I've already explained that certainly we need these forecasts because we want to predict what's going to happen, and we want to do so because of say monetary and fiscal policy might use these to design better policy outcomes and macroeconomic outcomes. It is also true that before an action is effectively materialized in the economy, so when say the government decides the fiscal policy, the budget, say for the year, it might take a while before this decision effectively kicks in the economy and generates a macroeconomic outcome. There are different ways of generating forecasts. One way, which is more data-driven, is about using leading economic indicators. Those are typically series that tend to move quite a lot with the series we are interested in forecasting, but also they display this desirable property of being leading indicators indeed, meaning that they do not only correlate with what we want to predict, but sometimes they tend to even anticipate what's going to happen to that particular series. So that is one way of producing forecasts, which is data-driven. And the other way we can produce forecasts, which is more theory-driven, is use large-scale macroeconomic models or macroeconometric models, meaning that we have a set of equations that we calibrate in line with our observation of the economy, and we can simulate what's going on and produce different scenarios, so we can shock our, say, stylized economy and try to see how that economy will respond in the wake of a certain shock. Okay. So the second approach is what we are particularly keen on at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, because we do have a large-scale econometric model that we use exactly for this purpose. So just to give you an example of leading indicators, so you have consumption in durables, you have investment, and then you have this consumer sentiment index, which is the green line. You can see that the consumer sentiment index already towards the end of 2007, beginning of 2008, start dropping. Okay, that is what a good leading indicator does. Okay, so you can see that generally speaking, the green line, so this consumer sentiment index, which is survey-based, okay, tend to correlate quite a lot with investment and consumption in durable goods, but then it anticipates an adverse event, which is the 2008-2009 crisis, by say a few months or a quarter perhaps, which is a very desirable property because it allows you to, in a sense, take on board a red signal and start prepare for what's coming. Okay, that's an example of a leading indicator. So survey data tend to be sometimes good leading indicators. Financial markets tend to be also quite good Financial market data tend to be also quite good leading indicators, because obviously financial markets have to bet against the future quite a lot. So there is a lot of sort of forecasting and prediction about the future. So if we look at theoretical models, we have different type of models, and there is a whole constellation of models out there. We have foundational model which make, say, more deep theoretical point. We have dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models, which are big models that tend to explore macro implications and distortions. They tend to be quite broad, and that's what the Bank of England is using, as well as a lot of central banks are using. Then we have models which are more policy models, which would be typically partial equilibrium, so they will look at aspects of the economy or segments of the economy and study the impact of specific kind of shocks. We have very stylized models or toy models that help us understand the stylized facts, and then we have forecasting model which are used to provide forecasts, and that's what this last class of model is typically the model to which our own internal house model belongs to, even though it presents characteristics of the other model. So I'll talk about that. Okay. So in saying that, I just want to pass the message that obviously there is a lot of options when we think about models, and some models would be better to answer some questions, whereas some models would be better to answer other questions. The bottom line is that a model as such is an abstraction, is a simplification of reality. We cannot have a model which is as complex as reality is, so we need to take some shortcuts. The type of shortcut we will take depends on the type of questions we want to answer. Okay, that's the sort of bottom line. Okay. So how can we produce economic forecasts? I've mentioned before that at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, we use NiGEM, which stands for National Institute General Econometric Model. It's a policy model, and a policy model is aimed at analyzing macroeconomic policy issues. So it helps understand some complex interactions, such as the effect of trade between trade restrictions between the US and China, or fiscal expansion in the US, what effect that would have on emerging markets, and so on and so forth. So the advantage of a model such as NiGEM is that it's a global model, meaning that we have different country blocks that are calibrated accordingly. So we can really simulate what happens in one country and see the impact of that policy or that development in a specific country onto the rest of the countries. That's a great advantage, clearly. So the idea of quantifying spillovers, so that's the key word here. So following, say, expansionary fiscal policy in the US, what are the spillovers to emerging markets? So that of spillover and that of interconnectedness is more relevant than ever. So already before the, say, 2009 crisis, you can see that the world has, become more interconnected than ever. So in this graph, you just get to see the dispersion of GDP growth across countries over a very long time period, so 1971 up until 2011, but the picture wouldn't be different if we were to extend the sample longer. So you can see that the dispersion in real GDP growth per capita tend to become smaller and smaller over time. So this is a sign that obviously, the world has become and is becoming more integrated, but also that shocks that we have tend to have a global impact. For instance, if you were to look at the dispersion of real GDP growth following the 2009 financial crisis, then you would see that in the immediate of the crisis, that correlation or that dispersion would become even smaller, because that is a shock that has affected a lot of countries in a similar way via, say, the banking sector. The US and Europe would become very much correlated. Then in the aftermath of the crisis, you see that this dispersion tend to diminish, and that is because countries have put in place different policies to respond to the crisis, different, particularly fiscal policies to respond to the crisis, depending on the fiscal space each country would have. So the idea is that because this interconnectedness is more relevant than ever, then we must think at developments in one country as heavily interconnected with what happens in other countries. Okay, so this is the whole idea of having a global policy model. NiGEM, so our model has been evolving quite a lot, is a peer-reviewed global model, meaning that it has been subject to scrutiny of academics as well as policymakers, and it's been around for over 30 years. It is now being used by both policymakers in the private sectors to use to make economic forecasts, if not as the main tool, as a benchmark for their own predictions. And it consists of individual country. So we have country blocks which are very well developed for a number of countries, and then we are able to, through trade channels as well as capital markets development, to see what the links among countries are. So we have 36 countries which are part of the OECD. We don't have Iceland and Israel. And then we have individual country models for Argentina, China, India, Russia, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Brazil, South Africa, Romania, and Bulgaria, plus a separate regional bloc which covers the rest of the world. It is based on a standard textbook macroeconomic model. It presents a degree of inertia, which is sticky prices. So we assume, as in the standard, say, macro literature, that prices wouldn't adjust immediately following a shock. So there is some stickiness in prices to adjust. For those of you who don't, have this concept, macro concept ready, think about, the inertia that there is in the economy for wages to go up. Normally, trade unions would tend to resist, wage cuts, and that, creates stickiness in wage adjustment. So that would be an example of sticky prices and wages, or the fact that, wages will not again adjust immediately because it takes time for labor demand and labor supply to clear. It takes a long time to look for jobs, and that would definitely slow down the adjustment of wages in the economy. We also have a forward-looking consumption and investment, meaning that in our model, people will tend to, say, consume today in anticipation of higher future income. And that is quite a likely assumption if you think about a macroeconomic model. Okay? And the same for investment. So we have that forward-looking component for both consumption and investment. We have a monetary policy rule. Okay? So we have the monetary policy. In the case of the UK, think about the Bank of England, respond to developments in both inflation and the output gap, so the output deviation from its potential level, from its long run level. And we have some long run fiscal solvency, meaning that we imply that countries, whatever happens in the economy will always go back to fiscal solvency. So we don't allow countries in our model essentially to become insolvent, to go bankrupt. Okay, because even though we might have seen in the last 10 or so years, countries such as Greece that has gone through a sort of debt adjustment, but normally we don't treat the sort of insolvency as something which we model explicitly. So it has to be modeled explicitly if you want to go down the route of sort of forcing a country to bankrupt and see what the consequences are. Otherwise, countries in the model wouldn't go bankrupt, and that is not any possible assumption, because we normally assume that countries would always be able to, by levying tax, sort of have solvency of the fiscal position by increasing the revenues through levying tax. And then we have individual countries that are related by capital markets through an uncovered interest parity position. Now, in the long run, again, this is consistent with sort of standard macroeconomic models. GDP, so gross domestic product, is determined by potential output, which reflects the factor inputs, capital, labor, and technology. In the medium term, GDP is mainly driven by demand side, consumption and investment. And whenever there is a deviation of GDP from output or output from potential, that means that there is in the model a mechanism that brings the economy back to potential in the long run. So we assume there are some long run equilibrium conditions that make sure that economies remain on a steady path, thus suggesting that you can have temporary deviations from this equilibrium, but in the long run, for model convergence, then we assume that this long run equilibrium is respected. Okay. So here I included a reference of a paper that provides details, including technical details, for those of you who are interested in knowing more about the equations that we use and the details of mechanism and dynamics in the model. There are a number of benefits of using a model-based policy analysis. One of them is that models can have multiple applications, so you don't need to reinvent the wheel at each time. Because we have a ready-to-use model, we can simulate different scenarios, we can answer different questions using what we have. Okay. That requires at the same time that we might need to think carefully about what is the pass-through of, say, the pandemic on the economy. So we need to be careful in thinking how to calibrate these shocks. But nevertheless, it is a great advantage to use sort of an off-the-shelf model to produce reliable forecasts in the light of different economic shocks or conditions. It's a model that incorporates key magnitudes, meaning it is calibrated based on our observation of the economy. Okay, so it is indeed relying on actual estimated parameters that are obtained from the actual series underlying the economy. It provides a tool for thinking about possible outcomes and scenarios, so we can have, say, a central forecast, which is our baseline, but then we can have different possible outcomes. So what if, say, the vaccine rollout is going to be slower than expected, what happens if trade war between the US and China take the wrong turn. So we can have these kind of scenarios which help us sort of also smooth the risk for our future. But we need to be aware of the trade-off in developing the model. So the key message is that a model is indeed an abstraction from reality. So there are clearly some trade-offs in using models. So what do we need as consumers of forecasts? Okay, so as people who might want to use forecasts, what do we need really? So obviously we want a clear presentation of a central forecast, of a baseline forecast, which is where we are sort of attaching higher probability. So we said, we think the economy is going to go this way, but we also want to have that central focus and understand how this central focus is generated. So we want to have a clear narrative around the central focus. So why are we betting on that baseline? But also we want a clear assessment of uncertainty, risks, and biases. Okay? So every forecast, every baseline forecast, whoever is the institution producing it would be with some confidence bands. Okay, so that tells you how certain an institution is about the outcome. Okay, so you would have, a central focus, but then there is a confidence band around it, suggesting that there are ways in which things could take a better turn or a worse turn. We need to be aware of the risks and possible biases. Obviously, when we think about estimating, predicting the future, there are at times, particularly when issues are very politicized, some institutional biases, personal biases, and so on. We need also to be aware of the sensitivity to alternative assumptions. So how robust are the results? What happens if we change, something? Also, forecasts need to be regularly updated. Remember slide 1, we said that forecasting is essentially, making an educated guess about the future, conditional on the information we have up to time t. So we understand that as time moves forward and our information set gets larger, we might need to update our forecast. Okay. There needs to be assurance about the forecast process, so that process needs to be, to the extent possible, as much as possible, transparent, reliable, and plausible. So what ensure that the forecast process is in a sense reliable is, that has to be performed by experienced and qualified staff, is to be transparent. There needs to be an analysis of risk and past forecasting errors. Ideally, when we use forecast, those need to come together with a, modeling details of the model, clear documentation. There needs to be some peer review and understand how these forecasts compare to other forecasters. Okay. Obviously, if you were to make decisions about your future, you wouldn't necessarily look at forecasters which tend to be very pessimistic or very optimistic. So you normally, when you look at forecasts, you tend to, or you might want that the forecast is somewhere close to the median in the distribution of other forecasters, and also understanding what are the forecasters' objectives. So let's come to the fourth point. What can we learn from producing economic forecasts? So the first question, I think that we get asked quite a lot as economists who work with forecasting is why no one sees it coming. Okay, so if you remember the famous question that was asked by the Queen, in 2008. So why no one see it coming? So just an example of forecasting at a time that is quite far away from the financial crisis, as well as COVID and other recent developments. This is just to show you how difficult is forecasting. Okay, so the red line is actually the unemployment rate in the US, just an example, and the blue line is the forecast made by the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, at each point in time. Okay. So you can see that in the middle of 1981, the Federal Reserve was predicting that unemployment would have sort of continued more or less on the same path at around 7.5%. However, unemployment started to increase. The Fed, towards the end of the year, predicted again that there would have been a peak in unemployment. So the peak of the unemployment suggests that we're essentially approaching the end of a recession, and when unemployment starts to come down, then we start moving into a recovery, right? So you can see that the Federal Reserve predict the peak of unemployment shortly after, with a recovery, with an ensuing recovery, but that again didn't happen. So unemployment, the red line, kept increasing, and so on. So one message that we extract from this slide is that it is actually quite difficult to make forecasts, and it is difficult to predict turning points. If you remember the idea of the business cycle, so this alternation of peak and trough, so it is very difficult for forecasters to predict where the peak is, where the trough is. So it's quite hard to predict the exact time of that. Obviously, you can see that when unemployment started to go down from 1983 onwards, so when unemployment started to go down, it's sort of easier to predict that unemployment will keep going down. Okay, so once we are out of the, say, unemployment peak, so we're entering a recovery, it's quite easy to, well, it's easier to predict that that recovery will be sustained. Okay? So the hard part is really to understand where the turning point is. Just another example of the Bank of England central projections. You can see that these are the Bank of England projections. So in bracket, you have the corresponding projections in August 2017. And so these, are the, projections for 2017, 18, 19, and 20. So you can see that, these forecasts tend to be updated over time. And it is updated over time depending on, again, the Bank of England own information set. So depending on what they know up until the point where they make the forecast, they would, predict the economy would follow a certain path. Okay. So is it really that no one sees it coming? So for instance, going back to the table of the Bank of England, you can see that, there was no COVID whatsoever in the projections of the Bank of England at the time. So they couldn't predict that, there was going to be a pandemic in the first quarter of 2020. And so this brings us to a very important point when we reflect on the nature of forecasting. So forecasting doesn't mean to have a crystal ball. Okay, so unfortunately, as forecasters, we don't have a crystal ball. However, we can adjust and learn as time goes by about possible outcomes and developments in the economy. There are some indications at times that some things are, not completely right. For instance, using leading indicators or using sometimes model with underlying economic series, we can see that sometimes these, fundamental relations between the variables change, and perhaps change in a way that is out of the ordinary, so to say, or different from what we've observed in the past. So whenever we observe these changes, or we see that say housing market prices are increasing by a lot, so when there is a vulnerability even on the financial market, it's not always straightforward to translate that into a policy decision. Okay, so obviously, a policymaker would have very little leeway in the wake, say, of a financial market bubble to say, well, hold on, this is a bubble, so we need to start, tame the economy. So it's very difficult during, say, house price increase for government to say, well, this is a bubble. Okay, so normally these events or those vulnerabilities, even though they can be highlighted ex ante before they burst, they're nevertheless very difficult to translate into policy decisions because of the timing. Maybe the timing is not sometimes right. Governments might have very little leeway to take decisions such as, taming the housing market, because that would be very unpopular and perhaps unjustified. But also, as I showed you previously, it's quite hard to predict the extent of the downturn and the turning point. So do forecast errors lead to bad policy? Yes and no, in the sense that forecast errors are intrinsic in the nature in the process of forecasting. There'll always be some forecast error because, again, that is part of the exercise. But a good forecast entails having a range of possibility scenario analysis in place that allows us to attach a probability to different economic outcomes in case things go differently from what we predicted. So having these different range of possibilities allows us to share risk about possible economic outcomes, while at the same time design policy that is also appropriate. Okay, so we wouldn't bet on one running horse. We would spread that when we think about policy. Okay. Just to give an example about the difficulty of forecasting in case you're not convinced yet. So on the 30th of June 2016, the then governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, said, today, while the economy is more complex, our models less reliable, the bank has identified the clouds on the horizon and can see that the wind has now changed direction. So obviously, the UK decision to leave the EU was a very important economic news, and as such, it had to be incorporated into scenario analysis. Just to show you the GDP growth forecast that followed post-Brexit. Okay, so you can see that this graph suggests that every forecaster would tend to have a different vision or a different view about the impact of post-Brexit for the year following the actual decision. So after the referendum in 2016, this is the focus for 2017. So you can see that there is really a lot of different forecasts for the next year. Okay. Again, that normally suggests that there is some certainly bias. There is certainly some policy errors, but also there is uncertainty that make the whole forecasting process difficult. Okay. As I said, normally forecasting becomes easier as our information set expands and more information comes in. So there are several caveats here. It's hard to identify an actual shock in the data, so it's very difficult to predict what the effect of a given shock will be immediately. And it's also quite hard to tell how things would have been different had actual policy not been used. So it's hard to have counterfactual evidence. Also, uncertainty doesn't not help forecasting. But the good news is that, macroeconomic modeling can help us deal with these uncertainties and with counterfactual evidence. So by using a structural model, so a model that embeds structural relations in the economy, we can actually produce counterfactuals. So we can say, compared to a baseline of, say, no trade war between the US and China, what is the effect of say, trade restrictions. So a structural macroeconomic model that embeds all these relationships, both across countries and within them, help us indeed, cope with this uncertainty as well as the lack of normally counterfactual evidence. So policymakers and advisors need to grapple with these macroeconomic issues and anticipating what we've said a couple of times before, scenario analysis is indeed and remains today the best way for us to deal with this uncertainty and to deal with the lack of counterfactual. So we can quantitatively measure how the economy would have behaved if a given policy decisions had the policy decision been taken or hadn't been taken. I'm just going to show you a couple of applications, and this is for sake of introducing also the a training course that we are organizing. Andrea will, I'm sure, tell you more about, as well as I will, about how to use NiGEM for policy purposes. So what I'm going to show you is the result of some NiGEM simulation. So again, NiGEM is our National Institute Global Econometric model that we can use for this purpose. So for instance, the global implications of US protectionist trade measure during the Trump administration. So at the end of 2019, the US imposed, if you remember, a 25% tariff on about $250 billion worth of imports from China, and China retaliated with 25% tariff on about 110 billion worth of imports in US goods. So here is some simulation that the Bank of England has done using our own model, and so you can see that a trade war would have costed for the US about 2.5% of GDP, which is quite substantial, and that effect would be about 1.25% GDP for the world, for the global economy. Also, you can see that other countries that are not directly involved in these trade wars, such as the UK and the euro area, would suffer some losses as well, and that is because of the nature of the NiGEM model. So again, we quantify for spillovers. So while third countries such as the UK and the euro area might be made more competitive by the fact that the US and China are slowing down with this trade war, at the same time there is lower global demand that is coming from, say, China. So there will be some negative spillover effect on third countries as well. And if we were to consider tighter business confidence, so lower business confidence, tighter financial conditions, you can see that those effects would be even bigger. So if you look at the sort of last row where it says total, you can see that taking into account the uncertainty about the duration of the trade war, tighter financial conditions, as well as lower business confidence, you can see the overall effect would cost 2.5% to the global economy as a whole, as well as 5% for the US alone. Okay, so this is very, very crucial, the type of exercise that we do, because it allows us to think about possible scenarios and break it down to different channels through which a given policy or given shock would impact both individual countries and the global economy. Also, the exercise, so you saw before that the Bank of England has sort of conveniently done some simulation using indeed NiGEM, our own model, and that always represents a good chance for us to to think about what's next, right? So, for instance, the following the trade war, which is very much something happening on the supply side. So think about restriction to imports in China. The Chinese government responded with a fiscal stimulus that was worth 2.2% of GDP, as well as reduction in VAT and personal taxes. So we can simulate, upon the announcement of fiscal stimulus in China, we can simulate the effect of those fiscal policy to see how much that fiscal stimulus would have an effect both in China and in the other countries, again, quantifying for spillovers, okay? So again, at NISA, we tend to do different scenarios. So if we think about fiscal stimulus alone, then we would have the gray bar. So we would have a 0.5% increase from our baseline. So in China, and about 0.1 in the global economy. So that is the effect, but then even more so if we assume that the fiscal stimulus in China would, in a sense, improve business confidence and business condition in China itself, which is the black bar, and then in the burgundy bar, if that sort of fiscal stimulus in China, so this contracting policy in one country will be able also to boost confidence in the rest of the world or in the rest of the trading partners, and then we would have the burgundy bar, and that's where we have the largest effect. So if we assume that this sort of fiscal policy in China is sufficient, so to say, to spur confidence in China's trading partner, then you can see that we would have a much larger effect on China's trading partners as opposed to other policies. And this is all about making scenarios and sharing our own risk when we forecast. Obviously, similar exercise can be done with Brexit. Obviously, now we are in a situation in which one might start thinking about possible interactions between Brexit and COVID and so on and so forth. So just to show you, obviously, Brexit represents a very interesting exercise and still represents a very interesting exercise for the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, because of course there are different channels at play when we think about the effect of Brexit on the macroeconomy, reduction in trade. So depending on at the time when we're thinking about it, depending on the type of tariff and non-tariff barriers between the UK and the EU, foreign direct investment, movement of capital, as well as EU budget contribution, movement of people, productivity. So there might be some immediate effect, rebalancing of the economy to less productive industry, as trade could have slowed down, and some long-run consequences depending again on the type of deal, as well as uncertainty, which was very much a short-run issue. So again, this gives us a very good example of how, using the National Institute Global Econometric model, we can break down the effect of one event into different channels and really understand where policy needs to focus. Okay, so let's assume that much of the impact would come from uncertainty in the short term. Then we must think at policies that, national policy with the aim of reducing this uncertainty. Just to give an example. So this is one simulation that I want to show you with the different channels. Again, that is a scenario that we currently update and constantly update. As I said, as more information become available, but at the time, this scenario was concerned with a deal between the UK and the EU and a free trade agreement. So this is calculated relative to a stay scenario, so this percentage difference in GDP. So you can see the different contribution as we broke them down using our NiGEM model. Okay, so you can see that a lot, according to our model, would come from a productivity slowdown, lower net migration, a slightly lower FDI, lower trade, and not so much on the budget contribution. But again, these scenarios tend to vary and reflect certainly our bets on different possible outcomes. Okay, so this is a scenario that was done a few years back, but just to show you the different channels really. And I'm going to skip that one. And finally, we're currently working on the COVID-19 and vaccine effectiveness. So we are due to release that result on the 8th of this month, which is next week. We particularly looked at the unequal distribution of the vaccine worldwide and what the spillovers are from this different distribution of the vaccine. So just to sort of link this discussion to a few things that are going to that are forthcoming in our February 2021 National Institute Economic Review. We have a couple of scenarios in which we explore trade and unequal rates to the COVID vaccine, as well as we model the change in the US monetary policy framework. So you can read some of these scenarios, as well as previous analysis, including the one I've showed you in the National Institute Economic Review, which is our journal, which is published by Cambridge University Press. Just to conclude in the next 30 seconds, so we should strive to produce economic forecasts that meet the needs of consumers by being transparent, having a clear narrative with a wide-ranging assessment of risk, supported by rigorous model and strong governance. As I said before, forecast errors are inevitable, and as such, we need to be aware of the risk, plan in advance, have different scenarios, and track progress and see how our forecast evolves depending on how new information becomes available. Okay, that's the whole process of forecasting. So the benefits of having a global macroeconomic model performing these what-if exercises to provide a quantified framework for understanding how economies work, think about the possible scenarios, policy responses, and wider consequences. That's the whole point. And impose consistency. So we want to make sure that things add up. Okay, so that's a very important sort of reality check when we think about a model such as NiGEM. It's a model that has evolved, as I said, over the last 30 years. So as a result of that, new channels have become available, but also, things that have happened in the economy, think COVID-19, give us the chance to work on new events and understand how, different shock pass through macroeconomic variables in, the economy. The best advantage is probably that we can have multiple applications using the same toolkit, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel at each time. So I'll probably stop here and happy to take any Q&A. So I give back to Andrea.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Thank you so much for that very interesting and informative session, Corrado. I know we had a few comments in the chat box just saying thank you very much, how interesting it was, but apologies I had to leave a bit early. But for those that are still with us, if you do have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat box now. I'm sure Corrado would be very happy to answer those, at the moment. If not, you can actually email me and Corrado if you have any questions in the future or after this session. I know it was a lot of information to take in, but I thought it might be useful, Corrado, to actually talk about the 5-day course that that we are collaborating with you. So as mentioned, it's 5 days. At the moment, we're still looking at dates, but it will be going ahead this year. So who is it aimed for, Corrado?
Yeah, so we are organizing indeed, thanks very much for that, this 5-day policy course, which is open to people who are interested in forecasting. So we thought these today's presentation as an introduction to what's coming, so to say. So the course will be very detailed in the sense that it's an intensive course which will entail both some theory and explanation how the model works, but also application. So we will provide you with the tools and instruments not only to understand forecasting, but also to perform forecast autonomously. So you'll be in a position to perform some simulations and analysis yourselves. There will be some exercises that we will ask you and supervise you to do. So we have a team of qualified staff that will help you navigate through all of these. So in a sense, the course is short, but it's quite intense and will give you hands-on really on how to produce macroeconomic forecasts using NiGEM. So we will look at different scenarios and different situations, and obviously you'll have the chance to discuss with us firsthand about any questions or things that interest you, and we'll use NiGEM and sort of explore different options together. But so we haven't finalized the schedule yet, as Andrea was saying, but indeed the idea is that it will be a good mix of theory and empirical application, with a set of topics that we will cover, including indeed COVID-19. So we will show you how you can model COVID-19 in NiGEM, how to model the long run consequences of Brexit, as well as the global economy, so trade war and the likes. So it should be quite exciting.
Yeah.
From your point of view, but but of course, by all means, feel free to ask me or Andrea any questions, and I'll be very happy to answer them via email if that's better. Yeah,
absolutely. This is the first time that we'll be running this course, so we're very excited to have you on board with us. Corrado, if you could just go back into the presentation, just to the next slide, please, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Of course.
And just for those that are asking, we will be sharing the video and the slides to absolutely everyone who attended. So yes, you can share that. Just to keep up to date with more webinar news, please do visit our website at www.civilservicecollege.org.uk. We do have webinars coming up in the next couple of weeks, but if you do want to keep up to date with any of the training courses that we run, especially Corrado's, then you can actually look on that website and all of the information is on there. The next webinar will be taking place next Thursday on the 11th of February, and that is with our expert trainer David Wells on total supply considerations. Does your supply chain deliver its objectives? And then after that, we will have the second part of the 3 webinar series of New Year, New You, and this one will be based on careers, and that will be with Sophie Bryan again on Wednesday the 17th of February. So please do go on our website to check out the details and to register. And if you could just go to the next slide, please, Corrado. Brilliant, thank you. And this is our social media handle at cscollege.org. We are on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and of course this will be on YouTube in due course, but we will be sending the slides and the video to you all via email as well. And I've just put my email address in the chat box for anyone who does have any questions in the future, or if anything springs into mind later on today. I'm sure Corrado would be happy to assist with any questions that come through. Thank you so much, Corrado. It's been fantastic having you, and again, thank you to participants as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and again, yes.
We'll see you soon. Thank you. See you later.
Absolutely.